I never thought that the most painful blow of my life wouldn't come from an illness or from death, but from the mouth of my own daughter. I was sitting in the back of the ballroom, surrounded by golden balloons and cheerful music, when I saw her walk onto the stage, radiant in her blue dress, to give her thank you speech. It was her 35th birthday, and I, naively, hoped to hear at least one word of thanks. Just one. But what came from her lips was a dagger that stabbed me without warning. She hugged her mother-in-law tightly, helped her up from her seat, and with the microphone in her hand, said, "This is the only mother who matters to me." The entire room erupted in applause. I saw the smiles, the camera flashes, the bright eyes of the guests. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she turned to me and added, with that firm voice she had so often used to yell at me in private, "You can leave now." I felt the air escape my lungs. My hands trembled on my purse as I tried to hold on to the dignity I had left. No one looked at me. No one defended me. It was as if, all of a sudden, I had been erased from history. I stood up slowly, my knees feeling heavy, while my daughter watched me with that mix of contempt and triumph I had seen in her eyes so many times before. But just as I took the first step toward the exit, someone else stood up. It was my daughter-in-law. My daughter-in-law walked with a determined stride toward the stage. She took the microphone from my daughter's hands, and with a trembling but resolute voice, she said something that chilled the blood of everyone there. "I can't stay quiet," she said. "Today is your birthday, and yes, you deserve to celebrate, but you also deserve to hear the truth." The silence became so dense that even the background music didn't dare to continue. The guests looked at each other, uneasy, with that discomfort that only appears when they sense that something sacred is about to be broken. My daughter, confused, tried to get the microphone back, but my daughter-in-law held onto it with both hands, as if her life depended on it. "You've always looked down on me," she continued. "You've made me feel less than. You've treated me as if I wasn't worthy of being by your side. But you know what? The real mother here isn't the one who applauds your vanity or who smiles for the cameras. The real mother is the one who was with you from the moment you were born, the one who took care of you, the one who sacrificed her life for you. And that woman is standing there, while you're kicking her out of your party as if she were trash." A murmur of astonishment ran through the room. I, paralyzed, could barely believe what I was hearing. My daughter-in-law, whom I had always seen as distant, as someone uninvolved in my struggles, was the only one who dared to say out loud what no one else wanted to acknowledge. My daughter went pale. She tried to laugh, to pretend that this was all a misunderstanding. "What are you saying?" she stammered. "This is not the time for your drama." But the damage was already done. The looks were no longer on her, but on me. For the first time in many years, people were looking at me directly, as if they remembered that I existed, that I was more than a shadow in my daughter's life. I don't know how long that silence lasted. To me, it felt like an eternity. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, strong and desperate, beating in my temples. And then I understood. That public humiliation, which I had believed was my end, was actually the beginning. I left the ballroom that night with my head held high and my eyes dry. No tears could wash away the wound, but a decision was starting to form inside me. Something had been lit within my soul. I couldn't keep letting my daughter, the child for whom I had given my life, destroy me again and again. The cold night air hit my face as I walked out the door. I hugged myself and remembered every sacrifice. The sleepless nights, taking care of her when she was sick. The times I gave up my own dreams to support hers. The years of silence so as not to embarrass her in front of anyone. All of that was reduced to one gesture, to a few words of contempt over a microphone. As I walked toward my house, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. My daughter had sealed our fate with those words. But my daughter-in-law, with her unexpected confession, had also opened a crack in the perfect facade of that family. A crack that I planned to widen until everything came crashing down. Because if she had the courage to speak, I would have the courage to act. That night, alone in front of the mirror, I quietly repeated the words I hadn't dared to say in the ballroom. I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to give up. And that's how it all began. People often believe that the love between a mother and daughter is indestructible, like a bond that neither time nor circumstances can break. I believed that too. Maybe that's why the pain I feel now is so unbearable. Because I gave myself completely to a lie that slowly fell apart. When I think about my daughter's early years, my memory is filled with tenderness. I remember her as a newborn, with those large, dark eyes that looked at me as if I were her entire world. I spent hours holding her in my arms, singing her impromptu lullabies, while exhaustion burned in my back. I didn't care. In every smile, in every first babble, I found a reason to keep breathing. I didn't have a happy childhood. I grew up in a home where the absence of love was a daily reality. My sickly mother could barely handle me, and my father, with his violent temper, took out his frustration on us. I swore that with my daughter, it would be different. I swore I would give her everything I never had. A safe home, a warm hug, a refuge where she could grow up without fear. At first, I succeeded, but over time, the foundation of that promise began to crack. Her father, my husband, was never an easy man. He was a hard worker, yes, but he was also proud and distant. He barely paid attention to the everyday details that I valued so much. For him, raising a daughter was a secondary task, a duty that fell entirely on my shoulders. He became the judge and executioner of my efforts. If she cried, it was my fault. If she got sick, I hadn't taken good care of her. If she rebelled, it was because I had been too soft. And she, my little girl, absorbed every word. She grew up hearing from her father that I wasn't enough, that I lacked character, that I wasn't good enough for him. At first, she defended me, but as the years went on, she stopped. It was easier to join him than to stay on my side. I remember one afternoon when she was just 12 years old. I had cooked her favorite meal to cheer her up after a difficult test. When I served her, she looked at me with disdain and said, "Dad says you're a bad cook." I froze, the knife still in my hand. I asked her if she thought so too, and her answer was a shrug, as if my effort meant nothing. That day, I understood that the poison of contempt had already taken root in her heart. The teenage years were even more cruel. Every time we argued, she repeated phrases that weren't her own. They were echoes of her father and later, of her husband's family. "You're old-fashioned. You're a nuisance. You never gave me what I needed." And I, instead of confronting her, remained silent. I was afraid of losing her. I believed that if I just endured it, if I put up with it, one day she would understand everything I did for her. But that day never came. The arrival of her mother-in-law sealed my place in her life. That woman, cunning and with a gift for charming people, won her over with attention and flattery that I never knew how to give in such a showy way. She had money, connections, and sweet words that sounded like music to ears hungry for recognition. My daughter began to compare me to her, to see in that woman what I couldn't offer. And each comparison left me more relegated, smaller, more invisible. Little by little, I began to notice that family invitations were becoming fewer, that the photos she shared on social media never included me, that in conversations I was barely a footnote, an uncomfortable memory she preferred to hide. When did I lose my daughter? That's the question that keeps me up at night. Maybe it was the day I accepted silence instead of demanding respect. Maybe it was when I chose to be quiet rather than confront her father. Or maybe it was even before that, since the pain of my own childhood prevented me from teaching her to love me. The truth is, while she was growing, I was fading away. And by the time I wanted to react, it was already too late. She had replaced me. She had found in another woman the mother figure I always dreamed of being for her. And yet here I am. Despite everything, I still feel love. A wounded, mutilated love, but still alive. Because even though she pointed me out in public, even though she kicked me out of her party, even though she told me to leave, I'm still her mother. And a mother's heart doesn't obey logic, but an instinct that condemns her to love even those who hurt her. That is my greatest weakness and at the same time my greatest strength, because that love doesn't mean resignation. On the contrary, it means that I won't give up, that even if my daughter denies me, I have a right to the truth. And if she chose to forget it, I will make it my business to remind her, even if it hurts. What happened on her birthday was not an accident. It was the result of years of silence and contempt. But it was also the beginning of something new, because now I know that I am not willing to continue living in the shadows. If my daughter wants to bury me alive, she will have to watch me rise from that grave and give her back every word, every gesture, every act of contempt. And I will not do it with yelling or with violence. I will do it with the truth. That truth that they fear, that no one expects, and that will be my greatest revenge. The silences. If I had to describe my life in one word, that would be the most accurate one. Because what destroyed my relationship with my daughter wasn't just the yelling, the arguments, or the contempt. It was the prolonged silences, filled with an invisible poison that accumulated day after day until it suffocated me. At home, my husband was the one who spoke, and I learned too early that contradicting him was useless. He imposed his version of life, and we, both my daughter and I, had to accept it. The terrible thing is that, over the years, she not only accepted it, she admired it. He became her model of authority, her reference. I, on the other hand, was relegated to the role of a secondary figure, a faded backdrop. I remember one dinner in particular. My daughter was about 16 years old. It was just the three of us at the table, and she was excitedly talking about wanting to study music. She had talent. From a young age, she showed a sweet voice and a good ear. I encouraged her. I told her she should follow her dreams. But her father laughed with contempt. "Music," he said, with that voice that chilled the air. "Music doesn't put food on the table. That's for mediocre people. You will study law, like your cousin." I tried to intervene. "Let her choose. Don't force her." He stared at me, and before I could continue speaking, my daughter interrupted me. "Dad is right. You don't understand." And the silence fell on me, heavy as a wall. That was just one example among many. Every time I tried to offer her support, my voice was buried under the echo of his. She grew up convinced that my words were worth nothing. She learned that her father had the absolute truth, and that I was just a murmur, background noise that could be ignored. But over time, that role was taken by another person, her mother-in-law. When she met her future husband, I thought life would take a new turn for her, maybe give her the opportunity to find a love that would soften her. However, what I found was another long shadow that displaced me even more. Her husband's mother presented herself as a confident, elegant, charming woman. From the very first moment, my daughter was captivated by her. I remember her first visit to our house. The woman arrived with a bouquet of flowers and sweet words that sounded fake to me from the start. Even so, my daughter hugged her enthusiastically and as soon as she left, commented, "Did you see how amazing she is? She understands me like no one else." I smiled, even though something inside me was tearing apart. That, like no one else, was a cruel reminder that I had never known how to fill the place she needed. The silences became even more painful after that day. My daughter started spending more time with her mother-in-law than with me. Any important decision, she would consult with her first. When she had problems, she would run to seek her advice. I stayed on the sidelines, waiting in vain for her to include me, to let me be a part of it. But the only thing I received were cold silences, looks that passed me by, and short phrases that shut down the conversation. The humiliations came later, almost without me realizing it. Comments made out loud in front of other people. "My mother-in-law always has the right words. You wouldn't understand, Mum. She knows how to throw a party, not like you. I feel more like her daughter than yours." Each phrase was a knife, and I swallowed it in silence. I didn't want to confront her. I didn't want to drive her further away. I thought that if I put up with it, if I stayed close, one day she would open her eyes. But time showed me I was wrong. The silence became a habit. I would visit her, and she would barely speak to me. I would accompany her to her events and be relegated to a corner. In family photos, I was the figure that was cut off at the edges. I didn't even realize that I was slowly being erased until it was obvious that I was an extra in my own life. The worst thing was that I started to believe her. It got to a point where I myself thought I didn't deserve to be there, that maybe it was true that I hadn't been enough, that my mistakes had outweighed my successes. I sank into a quiet sadness, into a bitter acceptance that my place had been taken, and that no one, not even my daughter, would fight to give it back to me. But what happened on her birthday changed something inside of me. When she told me, in front of everyone, that I could leave, the silence was broken. It was as if the evidence of what I had tolerated for years had hit me in the face. And then my daughter-in-law appeared, unexpected, with a voice that defied that habit of silence. She spoke when I had already forgotten how to. In that instant, I understood something crucial. My silences had been my prison. I had locked myself in them, believing that staying quiet was the way to keep my daughter. But being quiet only took away my dignity. Now I knew that if I wanted to get back what was left of me, I had to speak. Even if no one wanted to listen, even if it hurt, I had to do it. The weight of the silences had crushed me for decades. But now, finally, I was ready to break them, and I would do it with the truth, even if that truth set fire to everything my daughter had built. I'll never forget the expression on my daughter's face when my daughter-in-law snatched the microphone from her that night. She, used to being the center of everything, to no one contradicting her, was frozen. For a second, I thought my daughter-in-law would just make a trivial comment, maybe a forced compliment. But what came out of her mouth was a torrent of truths that no one expected, and every word was a whip that echoed against the ballroom walls. "Today is your birthday," my daughter-in-law said, her voice trembling but firm. "And it's right that you receive affection, but it's also right that you face what you've wanted to hide for so long." The murmuring among the guests stopped. Glasses were left halfway to their mouths. Laughter was stifled in many throats. I felt my heart race as if it wanted to escape my chest. Something big was about to happen, and for the first time, I wasn't the star of the humiliation, but a witness to a truth that was dragging me from the shadows into the light. My daughter tried to regain control. She approached her with a strained smile. "What are you saying? Don't make a scene at my party." But my daughter-in-law didn't stop. I saw her grip the microphone with both hands, as if she were holding a weapon. "Your mother gave you everything she had," she continued, "and you, instead of thanking her, have made her your target of contempt. You've allowed others to humiliate her, and you've joined in the mockery, as if it were a sport. Do you know what it's like to see a mother leave your house crying because you treated her like a stranger?" "I do, because I've seen it." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. I, with my throat constricted, could barely breathe. I didn't expect that defense. I had never imagined that someone, especially my daughter-in-law, would have the courage to expose in front of everyone what I had suffered in silence. My daughter, nervous, looked at the guests. "Don't pay attention to her," she said, laughing forcedly. "She always exaggerates." But my daughter-in-law took a step forward and lowered her voice, as if speaking directly to her. "It's not an exaggeration. It's the truth you've hidden under your parties and applause." The tension became unbearable. I could see my daughter's mother-in-law sitting upright in her chair, with her lips pressed together and a furious look. She couldn't stand that her kingdom of perfection was trembling, and my daughter, seeing herself exposed, began to lose control. "Be quiet," she yelled at her. "This isn't your moment." My daughter-in-law looked at her calmly, and it was that calm that made her tremble even more. "No, this isn't my moment," she replied. "It's your mother's, the one you snatched away years ago." The words hung in the air like a verdict. I felt my legs tremble, but not from weakness, but from a strength I hadn't remembered feeling in a long time. It was as if my daughter-in-law's voice had given me back the dignity I myself had buried. The guests didn't know where to look. Some watched me with compassion, others with shame, others with a mixture of surprise and respect. No one dared to applaud this time. It was too real, too raw. My daughter, on the other hand, was falling apart. I saw her face change from anger to humiliation, from arrogance to desperation. She wasn't prepared for someone to confront her, and much less in front of everyone. She had always lived believing that she could manage appearances, that with a fake smile she could hide the rot she carried inside. But that night, the masks broke. I wanted to speak. I wanted to take advantage of that moment to say what I had held inside for years, but I held back. It wasn't my turn yet. Sometimes, the greatest act of power is a well-used silence. My daughter-in-law had lit the fuse, and I had to wait for the exact moment for the explosion to become my weapon. My daughter tried to compose herself, and in a desperate attempt, she hugged her mother-in-law in front of everyone. "She's the mother I always wanted," she said, almost screaming. "I don't need anything else." But the phrase sounded hollow, empty. No one believed her, because after what my daughter-in-law had revealed, everyone knew that it was nothing more than a childish defense, a last grasp at straws before sinking. I watched her in silence, with a mixture of pain and compassion. On one hand, she was still my daughter, the child I once carried in my arms and soothed on nights of fever. But on the other hand, I no longer recognized her. She was a woman consumed by her own pride, unable to see beyond her ego. That night, I knew that the war between us had stopped being invisible. Now it was public. And in a public war, the winner isn't the one who yells the loudest, but the one who knows how to wait and strike at the right moment. My daughter-in-law looked at me from the stage, and in her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Complicity. As if she were telling me without words that I wasn't alone, that there was someone willing to testify to what I had lived through. And then I understood that this birthday, which had begun as my condemnation, had become my opportunity. because my daughter-in-law's words were not the end of the humiliation, but the beginning of my revenge. That night, after the birthday, I returned home with an exhausted body and a wounded heart, but also with a mind on fire. My daughter-in-law's words had opened a crack in the facade that my daughter had built for years, and as I took off my dress and let down my hair in front of the mirror, memories began to fall on me like stones. Scenes from a past that never healed its wounds. Episodes that had left me with invisible scars. I close my eyes and see her as a small child, just 5 years old, running toward me with a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked in the yard. "You're the best mum in the world," she said then, with a smile that lit up my soul. That memory haunts me because it shows me that there was a time when I meant everything to her. And it hurts to ask myself, when did I stop being that? Over the years, the sweet gestures faded. I remember her adolescence as an especially cruel time. There were days when she would come home from school, throw her backpack on the couch, and walk right past me, without greeting me, without looking at me. I tried to approach her, to ask her how her day was, if she needed anything. She would respond with monosyllables, or with that silence that hurt more than any insult. One day when she was 15, we argued because she had come home late. I was worried. I waited up for her with dinner on the table. When she came in, I asked her to explain where she had been. She looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and contempt and said, "You're nobody to question me." That phrase split me in two. It wasn't just adolescent rebellion. It was a conscious rejection, a direct cut to my role as a mother. That night I cried in silence with the table set and the cold food still on the plates. Another episode was etched onto my skin like a burn. It was at her high school graduation. I worked so hard to prepare everything. Her dress, the dinner, the little details that I thought would make her happy. And at the end of the event, when the organizers asked the students to come on stage with their parents, she looked for her father first. I went up too, but when I tried to take her hand, she discreetly pulled it away. No one noticed, except for me. And that gesture, so small, broke my heart. It was as if she wanted to erase me, even from the photos that would immortalize her at that important moment. The following years were a collection of small and large wounds. I remember going to her house when she was already living with her husband. I was carrying a dessert I had lovingly prepared, thinking it would make her happy. As soon as she opened the door, she looked me up and down and said, "Oh, Mum, don't you get tired of playing the good guy? Nobody here needs your stuff." And she took the platter from my hands without looking me in the eye. I was left in the hallway, my smile frozen, while I heard her tell her mother-in-law in the kitchen, "Look how she insists on trying to show up." I remember that phrase as if it were yesterday. Each wound built a wall between us. I tried to tear it down with patience, with love, with resigned silences. But my daughter built new stones with every act of contempt. It got to a point where I understood that she didn't want reconciliation, that her choice was clear. She had decided to give another woman the place that belonged to me. And the worst part was that she did it with a cruelty that seemed to seek my total surrender. On those lonely nights, I wondered if I had failed as a mother, if maybe I hadn't given her enough, or if I had overprotected her too much. Guilt consumed me. I thought that my own past, my broken childhood, had influenced the way I raised her. Maybe, without realizing it, I had suffocated her with my fears. And she found in her mother-in-law the free and confident figure that I could never be. But then I remembered everything I had sacrificed. The years of work, the sleepless nights, the dreams I put away in a drawer so she could fulfill hers. And I understood that no, it wasn't a lack of love or dedication. The problem was that, in her ambition for recognition, She chose to deny her roots. I was the uncomfortable part of her story, the one she preferred to hide to shine in front of others. Those open wounds never closed, and on her birthday, they all bled at the same time. When she told me in front of everyone that I could leave, it wasn't just a humiliation. It was the cruel summary of years of accumulated contempt. But the difference now was that I wasn't going to be quiet anymore, because those wounds, though they hurt, had also made me strong. Every hidden tear, every swallowed insult, every avoided glance had forged me like iron. And if my daughter thought she could still break me, she was wrong. Now I was the one who was willing to break the silence, to raise my voice, to use the truth as a weapon. That night I promised myself that there would be no more tears in vain. The wounds would still be there, yes, but they would not be signs of defeat. They would be my war scars. And with them I would march toward the battlefield that awaited me, the one of the truth that had not yet been revealed. Pain teaches, but humiliation sharpens. And after that party, when I heard my daughter tell me in public that I could leave, I understood that the time had come to turn my scars into weapons. I couldn't keep expecting gratitude where there was only contempt. I had been quiet for too long. I had endured snubs that left me branded like a hot iron. But that night, with my daughter-in-law's words echoing in my mind, I decided that I would no longer be a victim. A plan began to quietly germinate. It wasn't the first time I had thought about defending myself, but I always lacked the courage. This time, however, rage was my fuel. I no longer sought reconciliation or affection. I sought justice. The first thing I did was open the drawers of my memory, the ones I had kept closed for fear of what I might find. I remembered that my husband, before he died, had left a trail of economic secrets, dubious investments, and documents that he always hid carefully. For years I preferred not to look, not to ask, because I told myself it was a man's business. But now I understood that in those papers could be my most powerful weapon. I started visiting the office that had been abandoned in the house. The smell of dust and old paper accompanied me as I went through yellowed folders, sealed envelopes, and contracts that I had never dared to read. At first, I felt lost, like an intruder in my own home. But with patience, I began to decipher each line, each number, each signature. I discovered that my husband had made deals with my daughter's in-laws, financial favors that linked our destinies more than I would have liked. And there was the irony. The mother-in-law she now revered was more in debt to me than she would ever have admitted. That was dynamite, and I knew it as soon as I read it. I didn't want to rush. I sought help quietly. I contacted a trusted old friend, a retired lawyer who had always respected me. I took him the documents and asked him to explain what they really meant. I remember him looking at me with his eyes wide open. "Do you have any idea what you're holding here?" he asked. "With this, you could sink your daughter, her husband, and even her in-laws." I felt a shiver, not because it scared me, but because for the first time, I understood that I held the power in my hands. I then began to devise my strategy. I made copies of everything. I secured them in different places. I even gave a sealed envelope to my lawyer, with clear instructions in case something happened to me. It wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. I knew my daughter's arrogance and her mother-in-law's cunning too well. If they discovered what I knew, they wouldn't hesitate to attack me with everything they had. Meanwhile, in public, I continued to play the role of the fragile, almost invisible mother. I attended family gatherings. I smiled when I had to. I lowered my head so as not to arouse suspicion. No one imagined that behind that facade, every gesture, every word, every look was being calculated. The key to everything was patience. I knew my daughter would make mistakes. Her arrogance made her careless, and her need to prove that she didn't need me would lead her into dangerous territory. I just had to wait for the right moment to reveal what I had in my hands. At night, as I went over my plan again and again, I found myself thinking about the past. How had we gotten here? How had that little girl who hugged me when she fell asleep turned into a woman capable of kicking me out of her life as if I were a nuisance? Sometimes the pain almost made me hesitate. But then I remembered every act of contempt, every look of superiority, and my resolve became as hard as steel. I also thought a lot about my daughter-in-law. Her courage at the birthday party had been the spark that lit the fuse of my plan. I wondered what motivated her to speak like that, if she did it for me, or because she had also suffered at the hands of my daughter. I didn't know, but I was sure of one thing. That woman, who at first seemed like a stranger, could be an unexpected ally. The plan wasn't just about exposing my daughter and her mother-in-law's financial and social truth. No, it was bigger. I wanted to dismantle the facade of perfection they had built at the cost of my humiliation. I wanted everyone, absolutely everyone, to see what was hidden behind those applause, those fake smiles, and those empty speeches. One time, in front of the mirror, I dared to speak out loud, as if rehearsing for the day of revelation. "I don't want your affection," I said, imagining my daughter in front of me. "I don't need your applause. The only thing I demand is respect, and if you don't know how to give it to me, I'll take it from you with the truth." That mirror was my accomplice for weeks. I practiced words, gestures, even silences. I wouldn't improvise. When the time came, every phrase had to be precise. Every pause had to sink her further into her own lie. And while everything was brewing in the shadows, I smiled in public, accepted the snubs, pretended not to hear the taunts. Inside, however, I repeated over and over, "Wait, Elizabeth, wait. Your moment will come." That moment was closer than anyone could imagine. There are conversations a mother never wants to have with her daughter. For years, I dreamed of us sitting face to face, talking without yelling or reproaches, and maybe crying together to heal the wounds we were carrying. But when I finally gathered the courage to seek her out, I understood that the only thing I would find was a cruel mirror. My daughter reflecting, in her hardness and her contempt, the worst of her father, and of the woman she now calls mother. I invited her to my house, to the living room that had so often seen us share simple birthdays, afternoons of homework, and movies on Sundays. She arrived late, as always, with an arrogant expression and her expensive perfume filling every corner. She didn't even apologize. She sat on the couch as if she weren't a guest but the owner, and crossed her legs with an air that I found unbearable. "What do you want now, Mum?" she asked me, with that impatient tone that had so often stabbed me in the chest. "I'm busy." I looked at her in silence for a few seconds. She had so much of me in her features that it hurt. The same dark hair, the same broad forehead. But in her eyes, there was no tenderness or recognition. There was coldness. "I wanted to talk to you," I finally said. "Not as enemies, but as mother and daughter." She laughed, a dry laugh that tore me apart inside. "Mother and daughter? We stopped being that a long time ago." I bit my lip. I didn't want to cry, not in front of her. "Why, honey? Why do you hate me so much?" Her response was a look filled with resentment. "Because you were never enough. Always small, always faded, always begging for a place. Dad was right. You were a nuisance, and I didn't want to be like you." I felt the blow like a sledgehammer to the stomach. Hearing the same words from her mouth that her father had thrown at me so many times was unbearable. It was like reliving all the years of humiliation, but amplified in the voice of my own flesh and blood. "Everything I did was for you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I gave up my dreams, my life, so you could have what I didn't." "And what was the point?" she interrupted me. "You never gave me what I truly needed. Pride. I found it with my in-laws. She taught me how to be strong, not to depend on anyone, to have presence. You, on the other hand, were always everyone's shadow." Her words made me tremble, but they also ignited a fire in me. "Presence?" I said, raising my voice. "You call it presence to trample on your mother? To erase your own history? That woman wasn't with you on nights of fever. She didn't walk you to school in the rain. She didn't sell her things to buy you your books. That woman only showed up when you were already made, when it was easy to latch onto your pride." She looked away, uncomfortable for the first time, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "What's done is done. You chose to be invisible. Don't blame me for finding another figure who represented me better." I froze. It was the confirmation that I had lost her, that no words, no memories, no sacrifice could reverse the wall she had built between us. However, something changed in me at that moment. I no longer felt sadness. I felt rage. A cold, calculated fury that didn't lead me to yelling or begging, but to the certainty that I had to move forward with my plan. She had made her decision to disown me. I would make mine, to show her that not everything in life can be erased or replaced. "All right," I said, standing up. "If that's what you think, then there's nothing more to talk about." She smiled with that triumphant smirk I knew all too well. "Finally, you understand." But she didn't understand anything, because while she thought she had defeated me, I already had in my hands the pieces that would bring down the castle of arrogance she had built with her mother-in-law. I walked her to the door. Before leaving, she turned and delivered one last blow. "When I talk about my mother, I don't think of you. Get used to it." I closed the door slowly, my heart on fire. I leaned against the wood and let out a deep sigh. I didn't cry, not anymore, because instead of tears, what ran through me was a new energy, an absolute certainty. She had given me the reason not to stop. At that moment, I understood that my daughter had become a mirror of everything I hated. Her father's arrogance, her mother-in-law's manipulation, the coldness of misunderstood power, and I would no longer try to save her from herself. My mission now was different: to rip that mirror away and show it to her in front of everyone, even if it was the last thing I ever did. Because if she wanted to see me as a shadow, she would learn that shadows also know how to envelop everything, to the point of suffocating the light that believes itself to be eternal. Just when I thought everything would end in that private confrontation with my daughter, the unexpected voice of my daughter-in-law appeared again. She, who had lit the first spark at that birthday party, returned with even greater force. And this time, she didn't just speak for me. She spoke against the entire facade that my daughter and her mother-in-law had built for years. It happened at a family gathering, one of those that seemed designed to show a perfect portrait. It was the wedding anniversary of my daughter and her husband, and the ballroom was decorated with a luxury that bordered on ostentatious. Guests, imported flowers, cameras capturing every gesture. I had decided to attend, not out of affection, but because I knew that these occasions, the ideal setting for masks to crack. And I wasn't wrong. My daughter's mother-in-law, dressed in an elegant suit with a rehearsed smile, strutted around like a queen among the attendees. My daughter followed her like a satellite, celebrating every word, every gesture, as if she were the only sun that illuminated her life. I sat in a corner, invisible as usual, but with my eyes wide open. I waited. It was then that my daughter-in-law, dressed simply but with the dignity of someone who doesn't need adornments, got up from her table. Her clear voice asked for silence. No one understood what was about to happen, but everyone obeyed. "There are things that must be said," she began, "because you can't live forever behind appearances." A murmur of discomfort ran through the room. My daughter's mother-in-law raised her eyebrows, surprised. My daughter paled, perhaps remembering the scene from her birthday. I, on the other hand, leaned forward, my heart beating fast. I knew that something big was about to erupt. "You," my daughter-in-law continued, looking directly at the mother-in-law, "have played at being the perfect mother for years, the irreproachable woman, the figure that everyone should admire. But I know what you're hiding. I know about the accounts you moved in silence, the shady deals you dragged your son into, and as a consequence, my husband. And I also know how you manipulated my sister-in-law, making her believe that you were the only mother she deserved." A cold silence fell over the ballroom. I saw the mother-in-law's smile crack, her face tighten with contained fury. My daughter, desperate, tried to interrupt her. "Stop it! What are you trying to do with all this? It's ridiculous!" But my daughter-in-law didn't stop. "What I'm trying to do is tell the truth. Or do you want me to show the documents I'm holding? Because I have them. I've seen transfers, contracts with fake names, agreements that were signed behind the family's back." The guests began to whisper. Some discreetly took out their phones. Others exchanged looks of astonishment. The perfect scene was crumbling like a house of cards under an unexpected gust of wind. I watched everything with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. I hadn't lifted a finger. But my daughter-in-law was fighting the battle I had planned in silence. It was as if fate had put an ally in my path that I never looked for, someone who had also suffered under the manipulations of that family, and who was no longer willing to be quiet. The mother-in-law finally stood up. Her voice, filled with rage, resonated in the ballroom. "This is slander, a lie made up to destroy me." But her hands were trembling. That trembling was the clearest confession. She was afraid. My daughter ran toward her, hugged her in front of everyone, as if with that gesture she could protect her. "Don't listen to her," she yelled. "It's just jealousy, a trap." However, her words no longer held the same weight. No one listened to her with credibility. The shadow of doubt had fallen over her impeccable stage, and in those circles, one shadow is enough to turn off all the lights. I, sitting in silence, let everything happen. I didn't need to intervene. It was like watching a chessboard, where, without moving my own pieces, I saw the enemy's pieces fall one by one. When she was done, my daughter-in-law left the microphone and walked out of the ballroom. She didn't seek my gaze. She didn't wait for applause or support. She simply left with the serenity of someone who has done what their conscience dictated. When the door closed behind her, chaos erupted. Guests whispering, others leaving with quick excuses, journalists improvising headlines in their heads. The mother-in-law tried to compose herself, but it was too late. Her image of perfection had been stained, and my daughter, with eyes glassy from rage, looked at me as if everything were my fault. In her gaze, I read hatred, a hatred so deep that it chilled my blood. But I also saw something else. Fear. Because even if she wouldn't admit it, she knew that my daughter-in-law's words had a basis. And what she didn't know was that I also held documents, proof, secrets that could completely sink her. That night, on my way home, I kept thinking about my daughter-in-law's bravery. She had taken a step that I still hadn't dared to take. I wondered if she had done it just for personal revenge, or if in some way, she had also done it for me. It doesn't matter. The truth is, her voice had opened a door that no one could ever close again. The family war had stopped being a private murmur. Now it was exposed, bleeding, for everyone to see. And I, who had lived for years under the weight of silence, understood that my moment was near. Because when the truth begins to come out, there's no one who can stop it. My whole life, I'd been afraid of public stages. I was always the woman who stayed on the sidelines, who avoided being the center of attention, who preferred to support others from the shadows instead of claiming a space for myself. But that night, as I entered the ballroom packed with business partners, friends, and relatives, I knew I couldn't stay hidden anymore. The murmuring was deafening, a mix of curiosity and anxiety. Since my daughter-in-law's confession weeks ago, nothing had been the same. Everyone was waiting for explanations. Everyone wanted to see how that drama, which no one could ignore anymore, would end. And in the midst of those looks, filled with expectation, I found myself on a stage, with a folder under my arm that weighed more than any memory. That folder contained not just papers, but decades of silence, humiliation, and wounds that were now transforming into my only language of justice. I took a deep breath and looked at the scene. I saw my daughter, rigid in her seat, with her eyes as cold as knives and her body as tense as a bow about to snap. Beside her, her mother-in-law stood with a stony face, trying to project dignity, although I noticed a slight tremor in her hands. Both faces reminded me of years of contempt, the gestures of superiority, the looks that reduced me to a shadow, the words that condemned me to be forgotten, and there they were, exposed to an audience that was beginning to suspect that this family perfection was nothing more than a facade. I opened the folder, and the sound of the paper rustling was like a gunshot that pierced the silence. "I've been quiet for too long," I said with a firm voice, even though my insides were trembling. "I was quiet when my husband humiliated me, when my daughter pushed me away, when this family reduced me to nothing. I was quiet out of love, out of fear, and out of habit. But not anymore. Today, I have come to speak, and what I am going to say will forever change the way you see those who have treated me with contempt." The tension could be cut with a knife. Some heads leaned forward, expectant. Others discreetly moved back, fearing the scandal that was coming. I calmly unfolded the documents. They weren't rumors. They weren't insinuations. They were contracts, transfers, bank records. My husband's inheritance and the financial relationships of my daughter's mother-in-law's family were tainted with irregularities. I had discovered it among dusty papers that no one expected me to look through. But there it was, the truth they had hidden for years, now turned into my sword. My daughter stood up suddenly, her voice filled with rage. "Lies! All of this is lies!" I looked at her without blinking and held up one of the documents. "Lies? Then explain to them why your signature is here, authorizing transactions that you never declared. Explain to them, not to me, why you agreed to cover for your father when he asked you to sign for him." The color drained from her face. Her entire body trembled. For a moment, her lips moved, but no words came out. The audience understood. The seed of doubt had been planted. And when doubt takes root, it's more destructive than any scream. The mother-in-law stood up, arrogant, her voice filled with contempt. "This is a setup," she said, "a personal revenge from a resentful woman." Then I pointed at her with the calmness of someone who knows they've already won. "If it were a setup, why are your hands trembling?" The murmuring erupted among the attendees. Some exclaimed in surprise, others exchanged looks of disbelief. The perfect image of that woman was crumbling in a matter of seconds. It no longer mattered what she said. The trembling of her hands spoke louder than her voice. I took a few seconds of silence, just long enough for the tension to grow to an unbearable point. Then I added, "I am not seeking pity or a free revenge. The only thing I want is for the truth to come to light. And here it is, in these papers that will be validated by notaries, in these documents that cannot be erased or ignored. They wanted to erase me, but memory cannot be erased. And today that memory exposes them in front of everyone. The notaries present confirmed the authenticity of the documents. The business partners, outraged, began to murmur among themselves. Some even left the room in a hurry. Those who stayed looked at my daughter with a mixture of contempt and disappointment. She collapsed in her chair, her eyes overflowing with tears that were not of repentance, but of rage. The mother-in-law, on the other hand, tried to keep her head held high, but fear gleamed in her eyes. She knew the mask had fallen. I closed the folder and placed it on the table with a dry thud, as if to say, "Everything has been said." I didn't need to yell. My calm, measured voice was more devastating than their screams of desperation. I walked toward the exit, while the ballroom was filled with murmurs, accusing looks, and the echo of a truth that no one could stop now. Before leaving, I turned one last time. I looked at my daughter, a huddled mess in her seat, her face buried in her hands. My voice was clear, firm, and final. I didn't leave, and I will never leave. I am your mother, even if you deny me, even if you hate me, and my voice will always haunt you. And then I walked out the door. Outside, the night was cold, but in my chest, a flame was burning that would never go out. It wasn't joy I felt, nor peace. It was justice. A justice that had taken years to arrive, but that finally rose with the force of thunder. The night after the public trial was the first in many years that I slept without being startled. I didn't dream of yelling, or of contempt, or of scenes where my daughter turned her back on me. I didn't dream of anything, and that emptiness was more restorative than any fantasy. When I woke up, however, I understood that there was still one more step. I had unmasked my daughter and her mother-in-law. I had returned the truth to the place from which they had ripped it from me, but I still had to decide what I would do with what I had left. My inheritance, my name, my legacy. For decades, I believed that the assets were something distant from me, that everything belonged to my husband, that I was just the invisible guardian who kept them in order. But in my hands were now the deeds, the accounts, the contracts that proved that a large part of that fortune, directly or indirectly, belonged to me. And yet what I valued most was not the money. It was the opportunity to decide. That decision, which had been denied to me my whole life, was finally mine. I didn't want to repeat history. I didn't want to perpetuate the chain of arrogance and contempt that had destroyed my family. If my daughter had denied me as a mother, I would deny her as an heiress. I met with my lawyer in his office. He placed a draft of a will on the table that we had already worked on in secret weeks before. I read it slowly, savoring every word. It stated with all clarity that my daughter was excluded from the inheritance, that she would not receive a single cent or a single property. Everything would be destined for a fund for orphaned youth and women who are victims of violence. A smaller but significant portion would be given to my daughter-in-law, the only one who had had the courage to raise her voice when everyone else was quiet. My lawyer looked at me with caution, as if he feared I would change my mind. "Are you completely sure?" he asked. I nodded firmly. More sure than of anything else in my life. My grandchildren will have to make their own way without depending on a last name, and my daughter will learn, even if it's late, that not everything in this life can be bought with arrogance. I signed the document with a calmness that surprised me. It was like closing a circle that had been open for decades, as if with that signature I was burying, once and for all, the shadow of my husband and the wound my daughter had left on me. For the first time, I felt that I wasn't the one obeying, but the one deciding. In the days that followed, rumours swirled. The news leaked quickly. The widow had disinherited her only daughter. The local newspapers published it, some with scandalous headlines, others with an almost poetic tone. Society, which had so applauded my daughter's union with her perfect mother-in-law, now delighted in the fall of her mask. And in the midst of all that commotion, I remained calm, watching from my window as the storm raged outside. It didn't take long for the reaction to come. One afternoon, my daughter burst into my house without announcing herself. She was distraught, with eyes red from crying or yelling, I don't know which. She confronted me in the living room with the fury of someone who feels that everything they had is slipping through their fingers. "How could you do this to me?" she yelled. "I'm your daughter, your only daughter." I looked at her calmly. "Daughter, do you remember that night when you said, in front of everyone, that I could leave? That day you were the one who disowned me." Her lips trembled. She tried to retort, but couldn't find the words. I continued speaking, this time without trembling, without fear. "You had me your whole life and you treated me with contempt. Now you will have to learn what it means to live without me, without my support, without my inheritance. Maybe then you will understand the value of what you lost." She stood there for a few seconds, as if waiting for me to break down, to regret it, to run and hug her. But I didn't. I remained upright, with my head held high, showing her that the invisible woman no longer existed. Finally, she left, slamming the door, and her fury was trapped in the walls, while I was left in peace. Over time, my decision began to bear fruit. The foundation I created opened its doors. Children who had never had a home found shelter. Women who had been silenced regained their voice. And I, seeing their illuminated faces, understood that this was the true legacy I wanted to leave. Not the wealth stained with deceit, not the empty titles of a broken family, but something that would truly transform lives. Sometimes, at night, I think about my daughter. I wonder if she will ever understand that what I did was not out of hatred, but out of justice. Maybe one day she will understand. Maybe never. It no longer matters to me. My life can no longer revolve around her contempt. Now it revolves around something bigger, my recovered dignity. I look at myself in the mirror, and I no longer see the broken woman who begged for love. I see someone who survived humiliation, who walked in the shadows, and knew how to wait for the moment to rise. And although I know that loneliness will continue to accompany me, it doesn't frighten me. I prefer dignified solitude to poisoned company. That is my true triumph. That when they talk about me, they don't remember me as the forgotten mother, but as the woman who didn't let herself be erased, who transformed pain into justice, and who, even wounded, knew how to rise. That is my legacy.